I'm just gonna say it. Politics? Kinda important. Hi. I know normally I do voiceovers, but I couldn't find any really good footage for this topic that wasn't locked behind a paywall for like voting. There was like stuff that was like $10 for 30 seconds of footage, and I was like, no, so you get my face today. Like I said, politics, kind of important. And with the last presidential election being so monumental, and the upcoming one being kind of a big deal, politics are being really heavily debated these days. More specifically, voting. Now, we just had the Democratic primaries. I guess there's still a few left to happen, I believe. Super Tuesday, that kind of thing. And despite these elections impacting the future of the country we live in and our quality of life as young people, most young people don't vote. According to an article written by the BBC this past March, only around 19% of young people actually voted. Meanwhile, a 2020 Business Insider article that featured US Census data states that 66% of older voters turned out to vote. So, kind of a big deal. Why would the age group that has to live through the upcoming policies, the upcoming bills, legislation, why would our generation, our demographic, why are we not voting? Well, let's take a look at that. So, to start off, one of the most obvious and common reasons is that voting can be kind of complicated. Obviously, the actual act of voting, you're just bubbling in, it's not very complicated. But to get to that point, it's a little bit complicated. You gotta register to vote, you gotta figure out your polling location, you gotta do all these things. That isn't really just taught in schools. You don't go to a high school class that's like, all right kids, when you turn 18, you're gonna go to this location, you're gonna be able to vote. That's not a thing. So a lot of people graduate high school or turn 18 while they're in high school and they don't know where to vote. And so they're never taught that. So why would they? They don't know. And as much as we'd like to believe that people will look it up themselves, people probably won't. I think that my family, personally, my mom took me to vote the first time I was able to and showed me how to how to get everything done. And I think that if she hadn't done that, I probably would not have voted. I am thankful she did that because now I understand the voting process, but a lot of people aren't that lucky. A quote from the same BBC article from before says, "A young person doesn't turn 18 and realize, oh, my voting location is here. Too many people assume that just because we have the internet, everything is obvious, but it's not." And I think that's really true because even with Google, it's still pretty difficult to figure out the logistics because you can find polling locations in North Carolina, but can you find your specific town? Can you find your area? What do you do if you need to update your registration? That kind of thing. A New York Times article from November 2018, which was midterm season, explains the issue, and it talks about how young people often move a lot. We're college students, we're going back and forth between college and our hometowns, or maybe you graduate and you move to a new city, that kind of thing. You don't really have a set home for a while. And that's kind of an issue with voting because you have to vote in your location, you have to register to vote in your area, your precinct, I believe, if that's how it's pronounced. So it can cause some issues, and it's kind of annoying to update your location every time you move. It can be very frustrating. And while it's doable, a lot of people don't want to do that because they're like, oh, well, I'm moving in 3 months. Why do I need to register to vote here? And, well, why don't they use an absentee ballot? That's a whole nother issue. Absentee ballots are super annoying to get. I've used one. I voted in my hometown a couple years ago while I was in Boone. I registered for a absentee ballot months before the deadline was, and it still came to me late. It makes it very difficult for young people to vote. Another issue is that those in poorer communities don't always have transportation to get to the polls. If you don't have a car and you live 30 minutes away, you could walk, but most people aren't gonna feel motivated to be oh, I'm gonna go vote because I have to walk, for a super long time. It discourages people who are not able to get easy transportation, which ties into my next point, which is another reason why they don't vote. Few polling locations. According to the BBC, it talks about how certain polling locations, there's so few in an area that people end up waiting for hours upon hours. You might go to vote, but you're in line for 3 or 4 hours, and that's just not doable. Obviously, everyone has busy lives, but young people especially, college students, they have classes to go to, they probably have jobs to go to pay for their apartments and stuff like that. They don't have time to go just sit from 9 a.m. to the afternoon just waiting to vote. There needs to be more polling locations so that people can vote. Another reason why people don't tend to vote in the younger demographic is they feel like their vote doesn't really mean anything. And I think that's the big one I hear from people I know, is that they're like, well, it doesn't matter, it's not like it changes anything. Or they feel like there's not a politician in office that is like for them. According to the BBC, a Harvard survey found that only 16% of those aged 18 to 29 agreed with the statement that elected officials who are part of the baby boomer generation care about people like me. So there's a bit of a disconnect between politicians in office or running for office and those my age, your age, that are voting for them. How is this old person how are they gonna appeal to my demographic? There's a sense of like disconnect because of like age and just like different generational values. And then according to an NPR study from 2018, around midterm season as well, some young voters also just feel that they don't really know anything about politics, so they're like, well, why should I vote? It doesn't do anything. When that's really not the case. Like, a vote can be a big deal. When I voted in my local election for my hometown, so not in Boone, but in Mount Pleasant, North Carolina, the candidate I voted for won by 2 votes. Obviously it's a smaller town, but like, if I hadn't voted for this candidate, then it could have been 1 vote. You know what I mean? Like, it can make a big difference. I feel like people get hung up on presidential elections, and presidential elections are important, and I think you should vote in them. But voting is not just about the presidency. It's about, agriculture and governor and mayor and all that kind of thing. And I feel like people get hung up and they're like, well, I don't like any of these presidential candidates, so they don't want to vote. When there's really so many reasons to vote. And I think that part of why people feel disconnected from politics like that is because high school students aren't really taught about politics in school. Teachers seem to feel like it's controversial, and I know many parents don't really encourage political discussion at home. They're not like, oh, get off the school bus, let's discuss whether gay people can get married. They it's kind of, like, oh, well, the parents talk about the politics amongst themselves and they leave it out of their conversation with their kids. And I think that's pretty screwed up. We need to talk to the children, but like high schoolers at a young age when they can get interested. They don't have to know the answers when they're 14 and taking a civics class, but it could help them get invested. I think that my civics class, it was just like, memorize these bills, memorize these amendments. And I'm glad I learned about those, but it had nothing to do with what was going on in the world. I didn't learn anything about the world I was in. I was just learning about stuff from the olden times, the founding of America. So I guess the question is, how do we fix this? How do we change this? Well, there are quite a few ideas on the matter. Research from Forbes in April 2020 indicates that same-day registration would be a huge benefit to young voters. So that would mean you don't have to register to vote months or weeks or however far beforehand. You just go to your polling location on the voting day and you can register right then and then vote. And I think that would be a great idea because not everyone has the ability to go get registered, or they might not understand how. If registration and voting was in the same area, well, that's easy. You just go to vote and you're done. Another way to encourage the youth vote would be like I mentioned before, in high school civics classes, let's get people involved. Let's talk about modern issues, encourage discussion. Don't shame people for their opinions, just try to educate and discuss politics of the modern day so they know what's happening in today's world, the actual world we live in. And I think they'll feel much more inclined to participate. So in 2018, on November 5th, 2018, NPR did some interviews with some students, college age, high school age, and asked them what they thought would get young people to vote. There were a lot of good answers, but I thought the ones that stood out the most to me were that we could work to make voting accessible to be online. Because I think if you could vote on your phone, so many more people would do it. This generation is so tech savvy, everyone's always on their phones. And I think that it would make it so much easier because, oh, I don't know how to get to my polling location. Oh, maybe I know where it is, but I can't get there. Well, just do it on your phone, do it on your laptop. It'd be so much easier. Of course, there are security reasons, can your vote be tampered with? That would have to be looked into. And I understand that's kind of an issue. So obviously it's not gonna happen overnight. But I think that it's worth looking into because I think it would make voting so much more widespread. Another good idea was to help young people get involved with issues they actually care about. So maybe politics seems foreign to them, they don't see how it relates to them, or they don't think it matters. Well, talk to people about, college education costs or women's healthcare rights, things like that like are very hot issues in this generation. And I think they'll be much more inclined to at least have a discussion and hopefully, get into voting and making changes in the country. Some of these are doable by you, some of these are not. You can't change what high school teachers are teaching like next year. You can't make voting go online magically. But there are ways you can get involved in Boone. There's the Watauga Democrats, which I have some good friends who help work for them, and I would like to get involved soon, provided we can ever go back to Boone if we've left. But they made it super helpful. That's how I was encouraged to vote on campus for the primaries this past spring. So there were lots of opportunities that they provided. They would stand out on campus and talk to people and tell them how to vote or help them register to vote. My good friend registered me to vote just because I bumped into her and she was like, hey, have you registered to vote yet in Watauga County? And I hadn't. And she helped me and it took like 5 minutes. It was so easy. They do phone calls to like call students and help them understand where to vote. They had debate watch parties, so like make it kind of a communal event, like maybe you don't want to watch the debates by yourself because you're like, why do I care? But if you get together with a group of people, you have some snacks, you talk about it, it's much more entertaining and also informative. They would spray paint in the free expression tunnels where to vote and like the hours you could vote. It's a really great organization and I think it's a great way to get involved locally. Okay, so say that's too much. Say you don't want to work for an organization. Even if it's just you try to bring up topics with your friends. Do you have friends that don't vote? Just talk to them about it. Be like, why don't you vote? And like, you don't gotta be like, I hate you because you don't vote. But just like talk to them, understand their reasoning, and then maybe explain your reasoning to them. Or just like have political discussions with your friends, it doesn't have to be a fight, it doesn't have to be something super serious all the time, but if you just work in political conversation and help people understand how this matters to them, how this affects them, I think voter turnout would be so much better. With recent candidates, like Bernie Sanders, so many young people have been super into him, but then so few actually turn up to vote. When asked, oh, I love Bernie Sanders, but then they don't vote for him. You can say that you're for a matter, but I feel like until we get people to understand the impact of voting, people aren't gonna vote because they think they're too cool for it. They think it doesn't matter, it's stupid. I think that by educating and reaching out and explaining to people, we can kind of help them understand voting is important and you should do it. And that's my speech. Thank you. My sister burned a quesadilla, so my house is filled with smoke.